Aloha, I'm Eric Holdeman, and welcome to Disaster Zone, a show about emergencies and disasters that can happen anywhere and at any time. Cybersecurity, with threats coming from so many places today. How do we protect our infrastructure and our own financial well-being? And to include our election security. We're talking today with David Matthews with DR Matthews, an expert in cybersecurity and incident response. And Dave, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And I know that you always wear a Hawaiian shirt 365 days out of the year. So today, because it's going to be 90 degrees, I figured I'd wear a Hawaiian shirt.
Thank you. It makes me feel much more comfortable.
Yeah, that's right. But we're here to talk about cyber attacks. And you know, you have a pretty strong background in cybersecurity. What is that background that you have?
Well, I worked for many years with the City of Seattle as the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer, and then with Expedia for several years as well as their Global Incident Response Director. Okay. Yeah. And I founded an organization called the Cyber Incident Response Coalition.
Yeah, otherwise known as Circus.
Otherwise known
as Circus. Is it a 3-ring circus? Or?
Well, more like 25 ring, I think. Something like that.
And I think we're going to talk more about Circus later in our discussions. But, you know, what is the extent of cyber attacks that we're seeing? I can tell you, my wife mentions, you know, I had this phone message that there's a problem with our Social Security account and call this number. I said, no.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, so.
Well, yeah, there are scams like that going on all the time, phone calls that you'll get that tell you that something's wrong with your computer and they ask you to log in and let them log into your computer. The biggest one right now is called ransomware, where they encrypt your computers. That's especially bad in organizations, and we've seen it happen in many organizations where they encrypt the entire database, the entire system network, and then a little screen pops up and says, if you send us some money, we'll unencrypt it for you. We'll send you the keys.
And with me, it's frozen all their data.
Everything's locked. You can't get to it anymore. So people respond to that in various ways. They can say, okay, I'll give you the money and because we have to get our data back, or they say, no, I'm not giving you the money and we'll just use backups. But in any case, it costs money.
Yeah, and it's typically it's Bitcoin that they want the money in.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Almost always, and Bitcoin changes back and forth, and it can be a relatively small amount to a much larger amount. And they might also come back and say, well, actually, that wasn't quite enough. We need a little more.
Yeah.
Things like that. So that's a big problem. And then there's always the insider threats, the people who just for whatever reason aren't happy with your organization and do something from the inside because they have that access. So there's a lot of different things going on, but those are the big ones right now.
And one of the aspects of that, I was just last week at the Northwest Marine Terminals Association meeting. They had in Oregon. I talked about a little bit about cybersecurity and more about the program we're working on. And I said, just because you're a very small port with maybe 35 people, staff, you're not Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma, Port of New York, New Jersey, that doesn't mean you're immune. A lot of small businesses, very small organizations are being hit with this type of ransomware.
Oh, very much so. And often because they don't have the infrastructure in place, they don't have a cybersecurity team or even an IT team. Yeah. You know, it might be their brother or their son or the 13-year-old that lives next door that does their IT for them, so that they don't have that kind of infrastructure to work on it and to be aware of it, to manage it. So yeah, that's a huge problem, especially for the very, very small public sector, any small business.
Yeah, but everybody's vulnerable today.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and individuals, of course.
Yeah, and so where are these attacks coming from?
Well, they're coming from all over, and you know, we've seen evidence of them. Some of the more toward organizations is criminal, and they can be from anywhere. And that's the hard thing, is to really, they call attribution. How do you really know where they're coming from? Because they can go through the internet and they can look like they're coming from one place and be coming from another. Of course, we've seen an uptick lately in nation-state attacks, and Russia and North Korea and Iraq and Iran, and mostly Iran and Brazil, and some of the other.
Right.
So when they start tracking what they can, where things are coming from, they see Eastern Bloc countries and just a lot of really, I think what we found is wherever there's a fairly good education system where people are being educated, but there's no infrastructure for them to go to work. Yeah. When they've been educated,
they become innovative and become criminal.
Right. Well, they find ways to make money, and sometimes the best way to make money is to scam their way through the internet. So that's one of the trends that we see.
I had the opportunity to talk about cybersecurity with some Eastern Bloc countries, or formerly Eastern Bloc, I should say. Poland, Hungary, that type of thing. And there are some law enforcement officials a part of this visiting group to the United States. And I asked them, what's their ability to actually identify and prosecute people? And they said it's pretty minimal. If it's outside their country, the ability to go after these international criminals is pretty difficult.
Yeah, whenever the Secret Service or the FBI or one of our organizations in the United States manages to prosecute somebody, it's a big celebration, and it takes a long time. And it's often through trickery. There was a case where they invited them to come speak. They knew who these people were.
Okay.
They invited them to come speak at a conference, and of course that stroked their ego a little bit. So they came to the conference, and the FBI said, "Welcome to the United States, and here's your cuffs. Here's your handcuffs." So that, but it doesn't happen very often. You're right. It's very difficult.
And what makes it so difficult to follow the trail? I mean, to know who's doing what. I remember the attacks on Sony Pictures. Mm-hmm. People thought because circumstances and that the movie The Interview, if I remember, they said, well, who would do this? But they had to do some detective work before they could point the finger at it. And we're talking about highly sophisticated American assets trying to determine this. So,
well, one of the things I did a lot of work with is forensics, computer forensics, and so I can tell you that that's a very difficult long-term project, even if you're just doing something on one computer. And when you're working internationally, you've got, of course, international law to deal with, and you can't just go hack into a computer in North Korea and say, looks like this is where it came from. The thing I talked about earlier, attribution, is very difficult because you can bounce off of other servers. You can use Tor, which is a way of disguising where you're coming from. So it's incredibly difficult to know who's actually doing the attacks, and usually I think the people who are experts in this are looking for signs in the code to say that, oh, this looks like it was probably programmed in Russia, or this was programmed in North Korea. They can kind of see telltale programming code that looks like it came from those countries, and that'll help them sort of narrow it down. But even then, they've got a country maybe, but they don't necessarily have a human being behind the computer. Really, the only way to know who's behind the computer is to walk up to the computer and watch them do the work, right?
So, later, the second half of the show, we'll talk a little bit about a program that you're working on reporting of incidents. But why is it difficult? Some organizations don't want to report the fact that they've been hacked, that they have a problem, that some data was stolen, that type of thing.
Well, there's a couple of reasons. For private organizations, it can be a reputation thing. They don't want to admit that they aren't secure. And for public organizations, it can be similar in a way. I mean, sometimes it's a reputation. Sometimes it's that especially private organizations, they don't want to share their intellectual property. They don't want anybody to know what they're working on. There's a lot of different reasons. And then really what comes up over and over again, and when we exercise and talk about this, is they don't know who to call. They don't know who they should report to. Or if they have reported in the past to the FBI, they may have put in a report and then they never heard a word back, and they don't feel like they're getting any value out of reporting. So, so without having that value for reporting, there's no real good reason to. Now, many of them have regulations that they have to follow, and so for those, there's regulatory processes.
Like the banking industry, perhaps.
And HIPAA for hospitals and healthcare. Okay. And electronics, the NERP NERC stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, those guys.
Those are all
Yeah, a lot of
actually
different
accreditation and
yeah, and they have to
governing
report or
order,
SEC stuff. So there's places where you have to report by regulation.
Okay.
And so those they do report, but again, they may or may not actually get any value out of that, any assistance out of that. Now the
It
value
goes up into the big black hole.
The value is in the bigger picture. So the more people that report, the more likely the FBI might be able to arrest somebody because they get more information, that kind of thing.
Now you've mentioned the FBI, but who else? What are other options for sending? Who else? Federal three-letter agencies, perhaps, or others want reports on cybersecurity?
Well, Homeland Security has the NCIC, it's called the NCIC, which is National Cyber Incident something, I can't remember it. Yes. And they have not only reporting tools, but they also have a lot of resources online that you can go and they can help you to lock your stuff down. They can actually respond to things sometimes.
And this for governments or larger businesses?
Yeah, anybody really. They're mostly working with public sector, but any critical infrastructure really is their main focus. So anything that's a critical infrastructure, so water, power, sewer, electric, all those different.
Okay, and then what about the Secret
Elections.
Service?
And the Secret Service works on criminal things. So they're mostly working with, they were the ones who did, fake money stuff, right?
Yeah, counterfeiting.
Yeah, counterfeiting. And that used to be their big thing. But now any kind of crime that involves electronics, they have the Electronic Crime Task Force here in Seattle. In fact, we're going to be visiting with them tomorrow in a circus meeting. So they will take on those tasks, and they have some great, wonderful experts who will do those forensics that we're talking about and put together a case against somebody who's done some kind of crime that's used computers, which basically every crime uses computers nowadays, so, in one way or another. So,
what's the level of coordination between all these federal agencies? I just know from my life experience and working, at the local level, state level, federal level, sometimes the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. Is that the case on cybersecurity?
Absolutely, it's been a problem from the beginning. It's how we got to 9/11. And it's still not really. I mean, that was the whole purpose of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security was to try to consolidate these folks, especially at the federal level, or only at the federal level. And then we've also got the fusion centers, which is another way that we've tried to address that issue. But it's still a huge problem, and it's still really difficult, and it still tends to be the case that if you report to the federal level may never contact the state level, so you just kind of jumped over all the people locally who need to understand what's going on in their local community. So, and that's a difficult problem, and one that we're working on.
Right. So we're talking about organizational level here, but I know a lot of individual citizens are watching this. And we're not going to go into detail, but if they're watching, they individually have had a problem, what would you tell them to do? Should they call 911, report to local police? What should, and we're talking just the individual, mom and pop, myself.
Yeah, well, small business maybe would want to call the police, but I think if you're talking about just individual people, probably the best bet would be to call your teenager. Probably going to get the most response and the most help from them. But there are reporting mechanisms. The FBI has a reporting mechanism. And again, like I said earlier.
So you could go online?
Yeah, you can go online and you can fill out you just go to look for FBI cyber incident reporting, and they will take that information, and it's not necessarily going to result in any, they do have some good information online that can help you be safer. But they're not going to come back and say, oh, thank you, now we've arrested this guy. Yeah. But everybody who does that adds to their information that they can then, the more information they get, the more they can put together and the more they might be able to actually prosecute
reporting
somebody.
Is very helpful.
It's very helpful, and it's very useful, and certainly encourage people to do that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, Dave, don't go anywhere.
Okay.
We're halfway through the program, and for you folks at home, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking more about cybersecurity solutions, and we're also going to touch on election security. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after this message.
So who's going to do what?
I'll pack the dead batteries.
Great. I'll only put what I don't need into a duffel bag.
Perfect. That's totally unhelpful.
No problem.
Meanwhile, I will try to comfort everyone by speaking in a calm voice. And who is going to handle supplies?
I can forget to do a list for us.
Thanks, pal.
We couldn't be any less prepared. I'm proud of you guys.
Talk to your kids about who to call, where to meet, what to pack. Visit ready.gov/kids for tips and information.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us today, the topic is cybersecurity, and we're talking with David Matthews, an expert in cybersecurity and incident response revolving around cyber incidents. And Dave, we said we'd come back and we talk a little bit about cybersecurity of elections. So what can you tell the folks out there? We're actually next week, Monday, at a particular event, we're doing a session on the security of our election system at the local, state, federal level, and you're going to be presenting at that. So what would you tell people about cybersecurity of the national
Well, so
system?
as we know, things kind of went downhill last year or 2 years ago, and we're still understanding what happened as far as the elections and actually attacks of the systems. I would, having actually worked a little bit with the folks who we're going to be talking with next week, I am impressed by what King County has done as far as its elections security. They've done a lot, and probably more than many other other jurisdictions, where they've had Homeland Security come in and test and make sure that they're secure, and they've separated things. And so that I think is a good example of how elections can be secured and need to be secured.
And the due diligence aspect.
Exactly, yeah, paying attention to those things. And I wish it were true everywhere. I don't think it is, which still leaves us in a place where our elections are at risk. So from a cybersecurity point of view, there's a lot we can still do and need to do. From a propagandist point of view, that's a whole nother story that it
creates this distrust.
Yeah, exactly.
And questions the validity of elections.
Absolutely.
That type.
And I think that's more, and it's more of using the social media as a tool for propaganda. I think that's the bigger problem and a much more difficult problem to solve. And it doesn't depend upon good security necessarily. It depends on better control over the social media and a little better intelligence and maybe education amongst the voting public.
Well, I always say, trust is in a very short supply these days. I mean, we're in a low trust environment across the board, and things like the 2016 election, the Russians hacking of the system, it just creates this lack of trust and confidence, maybe.
Yeah, confidence is a good word for it. Yeah, it makes it difficult to know what's real.
Yeah. So we talked earlier in the program about the issue of reporting. Who do you report to? How information is necessarily shared at the federal level or from the federal down to the state and local levels, and those challenges. So share the project a little bit information about what you've been working on and supporting here actually with the Pacific Northwest Economic Region.
Yeah, we've been working now for a while on this project based on our understanding from exercises, et cetera, the problem we talked about, that people don't know who to report to. They don't feel like they get any value out of reporting. They don't feel like there's a feedback loop that they need. And so we've done some surveys with a lot of the local organizations, public and private sector, and academics, et cetera. And decided, it felt like the best solution to that would be a way to centralize and standardize the way of reporting so people understood. So we're creating a concept of operations that we could share in the region.
This is a written document.
Yeah, in the region that says, first of all, what should you report? When is it important to report? How do you know that? When is it going? And basically, that's based on the severity of the incident and the who it'll affect, how many people it might affect outside your organization, if it's affecting critical infrastructure, that kind of thing. And then once you've decided, yes, I need to report this, who do you report it to, in order to solve this problem we've talked about of making sure that the information gets to the people that need to hear about it, and making sure that you actually get some feedback in the process. So that said, we've worked with the Washington State Fusion Center, and it looks like at this point that's where we're kind of headed with this, is that they could be a central reporting place, and we're creating some standardized reporting tools that could be used for people to contact them, put in their report, and then they can help with disseminating it where it needs to be
And they would
shared.
disseminate it across, if a water district, for instance, was being attacked, they'd share it with other water districts.
Yeah, the kind of the horizontal sharing amongst other folks that are possibly going to be affected by the same thing. But also, because of Circus, we really concentrate on the cyber community as a whole. So really, there's no boundaries, or to some extent, water might be attacked in one way, but it's very likely that if they're being attacked, other organizations, not just water.
Yeah, it's not confined to
Yeah,
a single
exactly.
infrastructure or public agency. It could be private.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned Circus, and we talked a little bit earlier in the program about. So explain what Circus
Okay,
is.
yeah, we several years ago we did an exercise, and we were in the Emergency Operations Center, and we had people from the most important infrastructure of all, Starbucks,
Yes.
and we had the FBI, and we had Microsoft.
I'd say they serve legally addictive stimulus. So.
Right. And Microsoft and Amazon and T-Mobile and those private sector, and we had the city of Seattle, and we had county and King County, others. And so we were all in our different little pods, basically in the EOC, and we brought up a scenario, and we were talking about what was happening. And it was an attack on the water sector, in fact. And so we noticed in that exercise that people were standing up and walking over to Microsoft and saying, "What are you seeing on your network?" and the FBI, et cetera. So, and helping each other out, ad hoc. And brilliant people that we are, we realized, hey, we should formalize this, right? We should make this something formal, that we get together on a regular basis, create a trust network of community of cybersecurity that trusts
There's
and
that
knows each
word
other.
again, trust.
Yeah, it's very important, because you've got to know who you're calling, right? If you don't know them, you're less likely to call them in the first place. You're less likely to trust that you're going to get information in return. So we created this coalition of organizations, public, private sector, law enforcement, academia, nonprofits, and we get together on a regular basis and to create that trust and to share information with each other. And we have a mailing list that we share information on, and we're working on a more formal way of sharing information on a regular basis. But that's so that's what the Circus organization is about. And the idea was, you kind of have to have some things in place. Because you're working with organizations, you need to have their attorneys on board, right, and their C-level on board.
What's C-level executives?
Yeah, the executives, or in the public sector, the mayors and the governors and those folks. So they have to be buying into this idea of, yes, we're willing to share this information because we know we can trust these people. Yeah. We know that they're not going to put it up on YouTube or sell it to the Seattle Times or something like that, right? So, or a Stranger, even worse, right?
Well, I don't know. I think Stranger and Seattle Times are wonderful publications. So.
No, I'm just saying.
But that doesn't get out in the public domain.
Right.
It could be a TV station, radio, someone trying to make.
It could be King County Television, for that matter.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Right.
So in any case, the point is that people who are going to share information want to be able to trust that it'll be kept anonymous.
And the confidentiality
Yeah.
aspect. And we talked about trust, information sharing, and you've alluded to it, but it's all about interpersonal relationships.
It really is.
Me knowing you,
Yeah.
establishing a sense of trust with you as a person, and then you do that with your organizations.
Yeah,
also.
there's really no substitute for the belly-to-belly, nose-to-nose,
And
communication and really getting to know a person personally. Yeah.
Right. So we got less than 5 minutes left, but how about talking about that cybersecurity survey, the assessment tool you did, and
Yeah, as we put together the survey, what we were trying to understand is what do organizations have in place to protect themselves and to be aware of what's going on in their environment, to understand the threats. and do they have anything in place, for instance? And it ended up being a good tool for people to actually use as an assessment of their state of cybersecurity. Where are they with their cybersecurity, and what are the risks that they're entailing? So, or that are entailed in what they do or don't have. There was a very long version of that people could go through, and we offered that for free for everybody, as well as a kind of an incident response plan that they could incorporate into it if they didn't have one. And so, what we found is that, as we kind of figured, especially a lot of the small organizations have little or no support, and even the large organizations may have the support, but there's sometimes lack of coordination, sometimes lack of understanding how we can share with each other and that kind of thing.
And then you also created this tool, an assessment, where they could do a self-assessment.
Right, yeah, well, the survey itself, in the larger form, really turned into something that they could use as a self-assessment, yeah.
Okay, and that was both public and private.
Yeah, pretty much anyone.
So you've mentioned the Fusion Center, and the Fusion Center is run by the Washington State Patrol. It's Genesis. There's 50 state fusion centers. Washington has one. And I think fairly unique in the nation, not certainly here in the Pacific Northwest, is this focus on cybersecurity and then also critical infrastructure in the Washington State Fusion Center that happens to be co-located with the Seattle FBI office. Anything more you want to share about them and that function?
Well, the cyber function in there is something, I really appreciate the fact that they have that, and they have people who are dedicated to it and are interested in it. It needs more support than it has, of course, but everybody does. And especially if we're going to use them as our triage space, we're hoping that there can be even more support there and even more personnel that can do the work. But they have the nice part of it, of course, is that they do have that in-house sharing with all the different organizations, and they have threat experts, and of course they're coordinating their information so that if one person's getting information about the water sector, they can pass it on to the others, and so it really helps to understand the big picture critical infrastructure.
Another federal agency we won't talk about here, but part of our process in doing this program that you've been involved with, I've been involved with, is we brought on another federal agency that wasn't sharing information locally with the Fusion Center. So just doing this project has helped with that information sharing aspect to it.
And we're getting, no matter where the project ends up, it always helps for people to have a better awareness and to begin to start thinking about better ways of doing this. So I think it's going to be valuable.
Okay.
Yeah.
There aren't that many of you, cyber experts. I actually had a 17-year-old next door who's now, I think, 30 and living in Korea, who has got a master's degree in cybersecurity, but he's making more money commercially than working on it. That was my support system at the time that you talked about. So I just thank you for the work that you've done in the past, helping protect government, and now the work you're doing now in both the public and private sectors, what you're doing, sharing that expertise. And thanks for coming on the show. And as a memento, you get to keep the Disaster Zone mug. Take that with you. And every time you lift it, think about
disasters
and cybersecurity. So thank you very much for being on the show.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And for you folks at home, this brings us to the end of our show for today. Thanks for tuning in and learning more about what you and others can do to become better prepared for disasters. And remember, if you're going to get prepared, today is a good day to start. Have a great day, and as they say in Hawaii for both hello and goodbye, aloha.